The wisdom of trauma. What does that even mean? The wisdom of trauma. What's wise about trauma? Well, in a certain sense, there's nothing wise about trauma. It's just painful. I mean, I don't wish it on anybody. I don't wish trauma on anybody, wisdom or no wisdom. So it's not some kind of I don't have some kind of a spiritual point of view that says, oh, this is designed that way so you can learn things. There's other ways of learning. You don't need to have trauma to learn. You really don't. Ideally, we could and we would learn without trauma. That's true. So what does it mean then about the wisdom of trauma? I mean, you wouldn't inflict trauma on a child, would you, deliberately, so you can teach them something? You wouldn't take a 2-year-old and abuse them so that they can then learn from the trauma. So let's not trivialize this or romanticize this idea of the wisdom of trauma. So what does it really mean? Let me read you a quote from one of my prime teachers, who is very well known to the Sant community, A.H. Almas or Hamid Ali, who wrote somewhere that the fundamental thing that happened and the greatest calamity is not that there was no love or support in childhood. The greatest calamity, which is caused by that first calamity, is that you lost the connection to your essence. That is much more important than whether your mother or father loved you or not. In other words, the fundamental trauma was that loss of connection to yourself. And as I'll be telling you when I talk about trauma, that disconnection from the self is the greatest wound. So where does the wisdom of trauma come in? Our traumas can lead us back to ourselves. Our traumas are not random in the sense that the wounds that we sustain and how we deal with those wounds, they're not random. They're specific manifestations of where we lost connection to ourselves, and therefore they can be pathways back to ourselves. So what in this context, the wisdom of trauma means is that our traumas, how they manifest, how we relate to them, can teach us to be ourselves, can restore that connection that we lost in the first place. So that's what I mean when I talk about the wisdom of trauma, which also means that we can take two attitudes, broadly speaking, towards that trauma. One is to resent it, to hate it, to want it to go away. And oh my God, why wouldn't we want it to go away? And why wouldn't we resent it? Why wouldn't we want to distract ourselves from it? Of course we do. It's only that that doesn't help. Those approaches leave us stuck in it. So it's not that we're wrong to want to escape our traumas or their impacts. It's not that we're wrong to want to let go of our dysfunctional ways of dealing with it. Of course we do. It's only people that it's not helpful to do that. What is helpful is to be curious about it and to maintain that curiosity. At every point, okay, what can this teach me? What can this teach me? What can this teach me? And that's where the compassion comes in. And that's where the curiosity comes in. And that also means that a fundamental principle of this work, at least the way we envision it in this context, is that there's nothing wrong with any of us. The only thing that's wrong is that we think that there's something wrong. And even that's not wrong, because there's a good reason why we think that way. So rather than asking what's wrong here, we ask, what does this mean? Where did it come from? What did I make it mean? What can I learn from it? So that's the approach here. So let's begin with the basics. So the word trauma itself comes from a Greek word for wounding. So trauma is a wound. That's what it is. Now, if you take that metaphor of the wound, what is the nature of a wound? And a wound has, you might say, two natures. One is that when it's open and raw, it's very sensitive. So that when you touch it, or when something touches it, it really hurts. So in that sense, trauma is an open wound. So somebody doesn't understand you in the present moment, and you feel this pain. Well, there's nothing painful in itself about somebody not understanding you. If you understand yourself, there's nothing painful about somebody else not understanding you. If I spoke to you in Hungarian right now, and or then put it another way, if you spoke to me right now in Finnish or in Bulgarian or Arabic or Hebrew or Russian, I wouldn't understand you, would I? That would not be painful to you. You just realize this guy doesn't speak these various languages. There's nothing in itself painful about not being understood. However, there was a time in life when it was utterly painful not to be understood. When you were a small child and you needed to be understood, but you weren't. And that wounded you. So now when somebody doesn't understand you, that's that wound that's getting touched. That's why it's so sensitive. Because in you, there's a wound and a fear of not being understood. So that's what I mean by the sensitivity of the wound. You just touch it, and oh, it hurts so much. But all these pains that we have, they're not about the present. They're really about the past. And that's one of the prime teachings here, is that really the suffering that we undergo in the present, it's so much about wounding from the past, because we carry these traumatic wounds and they're being touched and then it hurts. So that's one nature of trauma, is the sensitivity of it, of the trauma wound. And as I'll be showing you later, pretty much every time that you're upset in the present, it ain't about the present. It's about the past. It's about your trauma. So that's the first thing, is the sensitivity of it. The second thing seems like it's obverse. When there's a wound, scar tissue can form. Now, scar tissue protects the wound. Scar tissue replaces the original tissue with something hard, something thick. And that binds the tissues together so the organism can continue to function. But what is the nature of scar tissue? While it's protective, it's also very hard. It's insensitive. When you touch it, you barely feel it because there's no nerve endings in the scar. It's also not flexible. It's rigid. So trauma, it's constrictive. So trauma is both this open wound and this scar tissue, where we're overly sensitive, I say, in comparison to the present stimulus, but also where it's rigid and hard and insensitive, where we don't feel, where we can't grow. Scar tissue doesn't grow. Scar tissue is not flexible. Now, the difference between psychic trauma, psychic wounding, and the physical trauma, the scar tissue, is that we can remove the psychic scar We can regenerate the original healthy psychic tissue that was hurt in the first place. We can become flexible again. We can learn how to feel again, or we can learn not to feel more than the present moment requires. So all this is healable. And that's the wisdom of trauma. So trauma is first of all a wound. You got that. And you also got that the biggest trauma is the loss of, is the disconnection from the self. That's the biggest trauma. Now, there's a wisdom in that trauma. Why did you disconnect from yourself? Well, it's not true to say that you disconnected from yourself. It's not like it's something you did. You didn't do it. It happened. The wisdom of your organism did it. When it hurt so much, and you were so small, and you were so vulnerable, and you were so helpless, and it hurt so much, what could you do but disconnect? Now, what could you do? You couldn't do anything. What could your organism do? The wisdom of the organism said, I better disconnect this person from their feelings, from their awareness, from themselves. Otherwise, they couldn't endure it. And that's the wisdom of the trauma, is you disconnect it. And then that disconnection has created all kinds of problems in your life. But originally, there was deep wisdom in it. And that disconnection then is the deepest wound. As Alma said, that the greatest calamity is not that this or that happened. The greatest calamity is that you lost the connection to your essence. So when the Buddha talks about the fourth noble truth, which is the eightfold path to mindfulness, or right livelihood, right mindfulness, right action, right speech, so on and so on. What is he talking about? He's talking about becoming true to your own nature, reconnecting. That's what he's talking about. Trauma shapes your view of the world. And we think we live in the same world. In the fundamental sense, we do, but in the practical sense, we don't. Let's say somebody believes that the world is a horrible place, that everybody's out to get everybody else, that it's worse than animals because we go after our own species, and that your friends want your house, they want your spouse, they want your wealth, and this is your friends, never mind your enemies. Well, let's say you believe that, and let's say somebody else believes that the world is fundamentally a benign place, that there's beauty and there's ugliness, but that the fundamental nature of the world is that it supports growth, that it supports safety. Well, those two people live in very different worlds. So trauma creates that view of the world which is distorted to one degree or another. Now, the first case, the person who says that the world is a horrible place and everybody wants what you've got and so on, that's an extreme case of trauma. Well, we all have a version of it. I've learned very recently, at least I experienced very recently, how difficult it has been for me to trust life itself. The difficulty trusting life itself is a trauma imprint. Now, some of you probably know that the person who said that the world is a horrible place was, until a few weeks ago, the president of the United States, because those were his words. And we know how he developed that worldview in a highly traumatic home, family of origin. So trauma creates your view of the world. And we know also that when you have that worldview, what damage you're going to inflict, because you're going to insist on remaking a world in that image. And didn't he just do everything to create a horrible world? Everything he could. And he couldn't help it because that's the world he lives in. So trauma creates your worldview. Number three, this is important. Well, it's all important. Trauma shapes your brain, or I should say, more broadly speaking, life experience shapes your brain. So the human brain is not an isolated biological organ. It's not an organ that's genetically determined to be a certain way. Its potentials are genetically determined, but how its potentials are realized or frustrated has to do with life experience beginning in the womb. So already what happened to your mom when she was carrying you was shaping your brain, literally shaping your brain. Which circuits will develop and which will not. Which neurotransmitters, which chemicals will be present in what quantities. How much serotonin, how much oxytocin, the connection chemical, how much endorphins, pleasure and reward, love, pain relief, the endorphins, dopamine, the incentive motivation. How many receptors for dopamine will your brain have? Has a lot to do with what your mother experienced emotionally during pregnancy. And of course, what experiences you had early in childhood when your brain was developing. I can say more about brain development later, but let me just make the point here that trauma interferes with healthy brain development. Because healthy brain development, like any development, requires the right conditions. And the right conditions for healthy brain development is a nurturing environment, a physically and emotionally nurturing environment. Trauma affects your capacity to gauge safety. So some people who are traumatized are forever hyper vigilant. They're always looking for danger. Now, this is something that's embedded in your nervous system. I'm telling you, I can be sitting here at my desk, typing away at my computer, and my wife Ray comes into the room, and I'm so intent on my writing that I'm not hearing her come up the stairs. And all of a sudden, she comes in and calls my voice, and I have this startled response. Now, do you know who has a startled response like that? Infants do. You clap your hand like this next to the ear of an infant, they'll go, well, that's a trauma imprint. I was born into a situation when there was a lot of threat. There were bombing raids and sirens and all kinds of other threats. So this startle thing, this fear thing is embedded in my nervous system. So trauma shapes the nervous system. It affects our perception of safety. Other people who were traumatized, in order to enjoy the trauma, they had to shut down their perception of safety or danger because they were in danger all the time. So that means right now they can walk into danger and not realize it. Some of you have been in relationships where you've been hurt. Some of you may have been in relationships as adults where you were physically abused or emotionally. And you can criticize yourself and be down on yourself, as people tend to do, and say, why was I so stupid to stay in that relationship? So you can do that. But if you want to be compassionate, you'd inquire, what is it in me that my sense of safety was shut down, that I couldn't protect myself? So trauma affects your capacity to gauge safety both ways. You can overreact and you can underreact. Trauma, of course, affects your relationship to other people because you will bring those traumatic imprints into any important relationship in your life. So those of you that are in adult relationships will not be surprised when I tell you that we tend to find in our adult partners exactly what troubled us about our parents. And all of a sudden, you find yourself back in your childhood. And we don't do this consciously. It's just that the template for relationship with other people was created for us when we were small. And we carried that template into our adult lives. And by the way, as I'm speaking to you, think of your breathing. How are you breathing right now when you hear these words? Shallow or deep? Are you present in your body as you're listening? Trauma gives you a shame-based view of yourself. You know that expression, you should be ashamed of yourself? Well, think about it. Let's say I promise to show up for this workshop for which 1,000 people have signed up. But let's say I don't show up because I decided I'd rather go for a hike. Well, you might well say to me, Gabor, you should be ashamed of yourself. On that level, it works, except it doesn't, because nobody should be ashamed of their selves. People can have remorse for what they've done or didn't do, where they were out of alignment with the truth, where they weren't being their words, where they were not honoring their commitments. We should have remorse for that. That's healthy. If you have no remorse, you'll be elected president of the United States. So I'm not talking about remorse. I'm talking about shame about the self. And so trauma inflicts on you, on anybody, shame about the self. And then we think, I have the shame because of what I did or what I didn't do. No, you don't. You have the shame because there was a protective mechanism for you when you were small and you were suffering. It was protective for you to believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with you. But that shame itself, from a certain point of view, has to do with the wisdom of trauma. It was protective for you, hurtful, ultimately destructive, but at that time, helpful for you to develop a sense of shame about yourself. So those are the points about trauma I wanted to make. Disconnection from the self, the wound, the sensitivity, the scarring, the pain that you carry from early experience, the disconnection from the self, which I mentioned, disconnection from others, or the misalignment of your relationship with other people, the distortion of your view of the world, the difficulty being in the present moment because of the past keeps showing up, how it affected your brain and your nervous system, and the shame-based sense of self. So trauma is a wounding. It's a wound. But it's a wound that hasn't healed. Because if it heals, you're not traumatized. So there are two features of a wound that hasn't healed properly that you will notice. One is that it can remain an open wound, and that means if you touch it, it really hurts. And so that certain events, certain phrases, certain looks on somebody's face, certain experiences will really, really hurt you. And you think that you're being hurt in the present moment. But actually, it's an old wound that's being touched that hasn't healed. So I'll give you a trivial example, and some of you have heard me talk about this before, but I also put it in my new book. I arrived home from a speaking trip from Philadelphia. This actually happened, I think, 4 or 5 years ago now. So I was very young then. I was only about 71 years old. And I, I, the airplane lands. It's a beautiful flight. I had a good trip, good reception to my talk. On the way home, I was bumped up to first class, so I'm just feeling like I'm on top of the world. And we land in Vancouver, and my wife Ray, I'm expecting her to pick me up at the airport, instead of which I get a text message saying, I'm still at home. Do you still want me to come? And so my response is a very terse text back, never mind. I tense up. I mean, I'm furious actually. And I get my luggage and I take a taxi home. It takes about 15 minutes from the airport where I live. And I come in the house and I barely look at my wife of at that time, what, 46 years. And for a day or two, I'm just in a sullen mood until finally she says, knock it off already. And I consider it a great sign of growth and maturation on my part that after 24 hours, I was able to knock it off. But what did I have to knock off? What was going on for me? I mean, it's just no big deal that my artist wife, who was a painter, when she's in her studio, and I've only known this for 50 years, when she's in her studio, time disappears. If you're an artist, you know what I'm talking about. You're just in the flow. You have no bladder, you have no belly, you have no clock, you have nothing except the art that you're working on. So that's what happened. But what am I doing with all that information? That information is not available to me at that moment. Because if it was, I'd say, okay, honey, I'll get a cab, or yeah, I'll wait for you. Come and pick me up. What's actually happening for me? What's happening for me, of course, as many of you will intuit, is that I am having an experience of abandonment and betrayal. Well, of course, that's one way to look at it. I mean, maybe she was abandoning and betraying me, or maybe she just forgot to look at the clock or she was into her art. But I'm reacting as if my system really knows that this is abandonment and betrayal. So those of you that know my history will know that when I was a year old, my mother gave me to a stranger and I didn't see her for 6 weeks. And that was to save my life. Well, guess what? As an infant, I experienced that as an abandonment and as a betrayal. 71 years later, this woman on whom I'm relying for presence and support and love doesn't show up. Guess what gets triggered? My abandonment betrayal scenario, which puts me into a rage. That's what I mean by a wound that's not healed. And you touch it, even slightly, and you get it if the event was happening right now. And of course, that's the essence of PTSD. I'm not saying I have PTSD. I don't. Not according to the diagnostic criteria. But as an aspect of it is that you can't tell the present stimulus from the past event that first hurt you. So trauma is a wound that way that hasn't healed. Number one. Number two, what happens in a wound is that you get a lot of scar tissue. That scar tissue is sometimes necessary, but what is the nature of scar tissue as compared to normal flesh? It's hard, it's thick, it's inflexible, it has no nerve endings in it, so there's no feeling in it. So another way that trauma shows up is through this hardness, this inflexibility, this difficulty actually feeling anything. So I begin with trauma as a wound looked at in those two ways. Now, if you also notice about my reaction to my wife, Ray, am I in the present moment? I'm not in the present moment. In the present moment, I'm a 71-year-old, internationally respected teacher and trauma worker and author and physician and all the credentials you want to throw after my name. That's what I'm in the present moment. And I'm an adult whose partner simply said, I'm sorry, I'm not at the airport. That's what's happening in the present. But I'm not in the present. I'm in the past. So trauma makes it difficult for you to be in the present moment. So typically, in the extreme case of trauma, what we call PTSD, and by the way, PTSD itself is a misnomer because post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not a disorder. It's a perfectly normal response to something terrible. It's not a disorder. It's not a disease. But one feature of that constellation that we call PTSD is that you hear a car backfiring in the street and you think you're back in battle. And I'm telling you, every time you get upset, 99.99% of the time, you're not in the present moment. Now let's take an example. Let me give you a very famous example. I'm sure all of you have seen that infamous video with this woman called Amy Cooper walking her dog in Central Park in New York. And this Black American man, whose name also happens to be Cooper for some unearthly reason, is a bird watcher. And he's telling her, put your dog on a leash. This is not an off-leash area, and it threatens the birds. And you know the outcome. She ends up calling the police, saying, this Afro-American man is threatening my life and my dog. Now, we can look at that incident purely through the prism of racism. And there's an aspect of racism that I'll touch upon. But fundamentally, her response, her physiological response, is not about racism. It's actually about sensing that she's in danger. She really feels menaced. And if you listen to the video, if you actually watch it, what you see is a person completely dysregulated. From the point of view of polyvagal theory, listen to her voice, what comes to her, the stridency of her voice and the expression on her face. Now, it's the mark of a racist society and white privilege that a white person can pour her trauma and give it a racist expression and endanger the life of a Black person, which is what happened. So I'm not minimizing the racism here. What I'm actually saying is that in a racist society, the trauma of one person can endanger another. But her initial response, let me tell you, has to do with her childhood. And I've read newspaper articles where she's had these episodes before, not around race, but just episodes where she overreacted to some perceived threat and became dysregulated. So that dysregulation and that overreaction, that's an aspect of trauma. And she was not in the present moment. Well, another aspect of trauma I've just mentioned is physiological dysregulation. And you get thrown into physiological states that are responses to threat or life danger. So when you go back to my situation with my wife, well, being separated from my mother, that was a real threat to me. And then my body, my 71-year-old body then goes into a physiological state that reflects danger, even when there's no danger present at all. And that's Stephen Porges and the vagus and how they myelinated the mature vagus nerve gets shut down and you go into either freeze or flight or fight mode. Stephen Porges, while I'm speaking about him, also talks about neuroception. Neuroception is an automatic, unconscious process by which parts of the brain gauge the degree of safety that you're experiencing at the moment. And that's a natural built-in mechanism, obviously essential for any mammalian life. We have to know when we're safe. We have to know when we're not safe. In trauma, the neuroceptive mechanisms of gauging, recognizing safety and the degree of danger get confused and disabled. So people will not recognize danger when there is danger. At the same time, they'll imagine danger when there isn't any. And so I'm sure some people here have had the experience of being in an abusive relationship. As a matter of fact, if you want to acknowledge that this happened to you, just raise your hand. Have you ever been in an abusive relationship? Now, here's what I'm going to ask you. Before the abuse started, I'm not going to ask you what happened or who or when, but before the abuse started, did you have any inkling that there was something wrong? Did you have any warning? In retrospect, did you look at it and say, oh yeah, I should have known there was something that wasn't quite appropriate? And most of the cases there was. That before the overt abuse started, you did have some kind of indication, inclination, gut sense, you might say, this isn't quite right. And what did you do with it? You ignored it. So that's another facet of trauma, of being disconnected from your gut feelings or ignoring your gut feelings when they arise. That's one of the things that trauma does to you. Now, just to review then, the wound that's touchy, that hasn't healed, that's scarred over so you don't feel, the incapacity or difficulty being in the present moment, the being triggered into physiological states that are not related to any current situation, not being able to tell threat or safety accurately, disconnection from our gut feelings. The prefrontal cortex, and there's some more trauma impacts, and I'm trying to give you as full a picture of my understanding of trauma as I can in a few words. So the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain, it's got many jobs: insight, awareness, regulating of body states, empathy, attuned communication with other people, but also response flexibility. So that when something happens, so when Ray doesn't pick me up at the airport, I might notice, oh, I have anger here, but I can really think about it. Then I have flexibility of response. Then I'm not going to go into a rage. I can choose. So trauma takes away response flexibility. It makes our reactions automatic and stereotypical and rigid. It's another aspect of trauma. Yet one more aspect of trauma is that you develop a shame-based view of yourself. So that fundamentally in trauma is a deep sense of one's unworthiness. That sense of one's unworthiness can show up in negative self-talk, as in I'm useless, I'm worthless, I'm not worthy of survival even. Or it can show up as absolute grandiosity. If it shows up as negative self-talk, you'll be in this workshop. If it shows up as grandiosity, you'll be president of the United States. That's how it works. That man is the most shame-based individual in the whole universe, except doesn't know it. He's totally disconnected from it. So every act that he participates in is designed to make himself bigger because he feels so little. And at the core of that sense of self is deep, deep shame. And then, of course, trauma shapes our view of the world. Now, the Buddha said once that with our minds we create the world. At least he implied that. That's the first line of his Dhammapada, his collection of saying, is that everything is thought and the lead. So how we think about things leads our actions. Totally true. So with our minds, we actually create the world. So that's true. But what the Buddha didn't say, and that's what the modern psychologist's job is to point that out, is that before with our minds we create the world creates our minds. So the world creates our worldview. So if you had maybe imperfect, but genuinely nurturing experience in the world, where sometimes you were hurt, but basically you were loved and taken care of, you'll develop a view of the world that, yes, there's pain in the world, but there's also love in the world. And I can have a degree of trust that I can find that love. That's your worldview, which sometimes you'll forget. And sometimes you go into a state of there's no love in this world, but you'll come back to it. But if you never experienced being loved, which is what Donald Trump's niece says about the man, you have a worldview that the world is dangerous, the world is out to get me, that the world is hostile, that I have to fight for everything, I have to mistrust people because everybody's out to get me. And that then will become your worldview. And that means that, and I'll quote you a depiction of that. The world is a horrible place. Lions kill for food, but people kill for sport. People try to kill you mentally, especially if you're on top. We all have friends who want everything we have. They want our money, our business, house, car, wife, and dog. Those are our friends. Our enemies are even worse. You've got to protect yourself in life. I'm quoting Donald Trump. That's the world that he lives in. That's his worldview. Well, that man is totally isolated. If that's how he thinks of his friends, he has no friends. So trauma at the extreme isolates us from the world. And ultimately, trauma disconnects us from ourselves so that we no longer know who we are. I had a bit of trouble sleeping last night, so I was too excited. I was working on my book until midnight, and I got all excited about today. And so I was, middle of the night, I was lying there reading Bob Dylan's Chronicles. And at some point he says, and I'll get you the quote, but he says something like, I've lost myself inside somewhere. I have to find myself. So in trauma, we lose disconnection with ourselves, and that's the ultimate trauma. So the trauma wasn't what happened to you. It was that disconnection from yourself, which, by the way, also Peter Levine defines trauma, which is a disconnection from the self and from others and from the world, but primarily from ourselves. And the overarching point I'm making here is that trauma is not what happened to you. People say that the trauma was that I was sexually abused. No, that wasn't the trauma. No, that was traumatic, but it wasn't the trauma. The trauma was what that caused to happen inside yourself. All these disconnections that I've been talking about. If you had been sexually abused, God forbid, but if you'd had the support, the understanding, the validation, and then the protection that it wouldn't happen again, you would not necessarily have been traumatized. The trauma is actually what happens inside of us as a result, which is good news. It's very good news. Because if the trauma is what happened to you a long time ago, what somebody did to you, or what somebody didn't provide for you, if that was the trauma, guess what? We're in trouble. There's nothing we can do about what happened a long time ago. But if the trauma is the disconnection from ourselves, hey, that's available to us this very moment, which is the very intention of this workshop from my perspective, is that we should get as connected to ourselves as we can be. You know, the COVID virus, the coronavirus. Well, those of you that have a medical background or have studied the science of it, you know that viruses don't replicate themselves. They don't reproduce. What they do is they take over the metabolism of the host cell, and basically they force the host DNA to make more viruses. So they cannibalize the host in that sense. Now, with the coronavirus, that's part of the problem. Another big part of the problem is that the people who get really sick with it seems it's not the direct effect of the virus that's creating much of the difficulty, but the immune system responds to it, which ends up attacking the body itself. It's almost like an autoimmune disease in that sense, in many severe cases. But the point is that it's something foreign and external that takes you over and then uses your materials and your cells and your DNA to perpetuate itself. That's how viruses work. Now, there's something about trauma that's similar to that. I was thinking last night. If we don't think of trauma purely as person A did something to person B, but if we think of it as a virus, as a perpetrator energy, because you see, the perpetrator has already been taken over by the virus. They have already been taken over by the perpetrator energy. Now, as with viruses, they can be more or less virulent, vicious. Some perpetrator energy are Hitler-like in their hatred and their violence and their ruthlessness and their cruelty and their self-aggrandizement. In the human nervous system and in the human soul, there's an expectancy. In fact, the human organism or any organism is an expectancy from a certain point of view. An acorn is an expectancy for soil and irrigation, isn't it? And without that, nothing happens. You can put that acorn on your table, nothing will happen. Your lungs are an expectancy for oxygen. Without oxygen, your lungs would not have evolved. Your lungs evolved because there's oxygen, as an expectation for oxygen. A whole organism is an expectation for what? For support, for love, for nurturing. That's built into a nervous system. When we don't get those needs met, we experience that as a perpetration. Not as egregious as being abused, but I'm not talking about the intentions of the parent or the subjectivity of the child. I'm talking about we as an organism are an expectation for that nurturance. When we don't receive that, we experience that as a perpetration. So that perpetration energy can show up in a form of abuse, but it can also show up when my mother doesn't pick me up and I'm crying for an hour and a half because I need to be held and I need to be fed. And it's not personal to her. That's the perpetration energy that she absorbed growing up and in a certain culture and in a certain family. And when I yelled at my kids, and they wanted to come to our bed at night, and I was harshly rejecting them. No, you can't. I was transmitting that perpetration energy. And it's not personal to me, and it's not personal to any of us. But it takes us over. Now, when you experience despair, I'll tell you something that I learned very recently. When you experience despair, the perpetration energy is taking you over, and it's multiplying itself. It's not you. That's the perpetration energy. Because despair is not a feeling. It has associated feelings, but fundamentally it's a point of view. And what is the point of view of despair? That there's no support and I'm alone. That's the point of view. Well, that's the perpetration energy. And what I learned recently is that I don't have to grant the perpetrators that victory. I don't have to do that. And neither do you. Now, honest to God, a week ago, I wouldn't have said this. It's just that I learned something. I experienced something. And so notice that perpetration energy in you. It's not personal to you. It's not personal even to the people through whom it came to you. It's part of the culture. Don't believe it, or at least notice it. Okay? Just notice it.